Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this doctoral meeting. Today is an important doctoral meeting because I'm here as a presenter, so it's a joke. It's a pleasure to me to introduce Luca Nannini. He has an extensive curriculum that I'm not going to learn to read here. Currently, he's doing his PhD with us at the CiTIUS. So today he's going to talk about explainability in process mining, a framework for improved decisions making. So you have around 35 minutes. Okay, so the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Alberto, for the presentation. And yes, indeed, like my thesis is regarding explainability in process mining, a framework for improved decision making. So just a little bit of my background overview. Basically, I didn't study as many of you computer science or engineering, but my background is foremost in linguistics and quantity science. And this is an approach also, let's say, informing my current thesis. I'm let's say, working on explainability in process mining, departing from this main research question. So how explainability can basically favor the adoption and the engagement of process mining solutions. And if you watch this representation, you can see several domains at the intersection. Foremost, we have ACI, human-computer interaction, we have process mining, we have explainable AI, and then as a ground, we have AI governance. So in the house side, we have also, let's say, the consultancy, policy, operationalization side of the technology solutions. So in order to get started, one thing I really care about is just to give you a little bit of context of what is an explanation in humans and also in AI. So I will not dwell, but I will not really go in depth, trying to detail on what constitutes an explanation. And also currently I'm working on let's say a research paper on trying to define different perspectives on explanations from quantity science, psychology, science, logic, and other things. But you can basically get a grasp from these taxonomies that explanations can be used both to describe systems, but also to describe the functionality of these systems and what to do in the future with these systems. So let's say that, long story short, ideally with an explanation, we advance our epistemology. So we try to get to know the truth. And if there is no truth, for example, if you are at the bar chatting with your friends and you're talking about your behavior, your mental states, you can use justifications. You can use more evaluation as explanations. You can basically use explanations in order to learn. And also when you have to teach something to somebody else, you're forced to create mental representation. This is really a fascinating concept because essentially an explanation is a cognitive mechanisms that is relying on different kind of inferences. And this is a distinction that it was made also by Charles Peirce and before from Aristotle, that we have different kind of inferences. We have deduction, induction that are pretty famous in scientific explanation. And then we have abduction, abductive inference, that is also called the inference to the best explanation. So without say talking too much on explainability in the humans, what I want to stress is that explanations are of many kinds, are heterogeneous, are highly contextual, and also are prone oftentimes to risks, to epistemological risks. Again, here, this is a taxonomy I'm now developing in a research paper. And just to give you a brief example, if I have to recall a past experience or I have to detail to you the process components and I'm not able to recall correctly, I am misinterpreting how things are correctly working in a system. If I'm just providing, let's say, repetition, if I'm just self-referential, I can, let's say, fall into the trap of circularity and tautologies. If I can induce several causes in order to justify something, I am doing overdetermination, will, on the other side, if I'm giving, let's say, just partial explanation of an overall fact, I don't know if you can recall the example of the blind people and the elephant brought by Ettore during the last meeting. If I do that, I am doing underdetermination. That is actually a pitfall, at least in quantity science, for explainability. And then you have other kind of, let's say, risks. But essentially, it's all a matter of how the user is able to receive and how you are able to tailor to produce given, let's say, semantic models, like mental models, and how like they're able to adopt inferences in order to recall and align with your mental models. In these two, like the last two risks are particularly relevant also for AI, and then I will move forward. But transparency risks, think about when you're disclosing too much information in a system. You are also like disclosing potential information to game the system. You are maybe like jeopardizing privacy of third parties. You are violating intellectual properties and other things. Also, like when you have accountability risk is like, okay, trust me, like this is how things work. Like when I provide you an explanation that is underlying some sort of epistemic authority and the arrogance. So like we cannot get to know the factual truth of a system or something because there is some sort of authority preventing that. So moving now to AI, just like, again, to give you a really quick overview, it was also introduced by Ettore before. Explainability has been around for decades, and it didn't start with AI. It started with ICT systems already in the 70s, actually, but has been brought to a new revival in the last, let's say, 5-10 years, thanks to really complex machine learning and deep learning architectures. And I want to make a distinction here in case like it's not clear to you. One thing is interpretability, and another thing is explainability. Interpretability is basically when we're, let's say, advancing inferences in order to justify, to make sense, to advance our epistemology over a system, over something. In the meanwhile, explainability is when we have a sort of communication, we have a feedback loop where we need to align and we need to recalibrate, let's say, our mental models, okay? So in terms of desiderata, explainable AI is really broad. Like, again, I'm not going to detail like doing a survey of explainable AI methods, but what you need to know is that you can do like different explanations for local or global behavior, for post hoc or hand hoc analysis of the data, of the output. You can do iterative explanations. You can do descriptive computational mechanical explanation from more, let's say, teleological explanations in order to provide recommendation, in order to suggest action that you can take over a system. So this is just to say that there is not a single target, type, technique, timing, and representation of explainable AI. It's really broad. And the idea is that like you can do several tasks from debugging to recommendations given different stakeholders' intention. When you create an explanation, you need to, let's say, privilege the user intention, the usability of the explanation. Otherwise, it's going to be completely useless. So how we evaluate explanations. In terms of, let's say, qualitative evaluations with end users, there are 3 dimensions that normally are considered in the literature, are acceptance, comprehension or understanding, and then performance. So in other words, okay, I'm hearing an explanation about something. That makes sense, that rings a bell. I'm going to accept it as faithful, as complete, as, you know, well proposed. Then how like this explanation is going to update the mental model, let's say the representation that I have of an AI process, an AI system. And then afterwards, how the explanation will allow me to perform better over a given task. Like, for example, you know, with the AI system and the bank loan thing, how can I improve my condition upon that? Yet, as I was like already introduced to you kind of subtly, we can have different approaches in explainable AI. Before I was detailing like really shortly about the machine learning community. Now we are already in the ACI community, in the human-computer interaction community. One of the limitations of the ACI community, even if it's really highly informative about user psychology, is that oftentimes is conducted in really controlled settings. So like the organizational values, the true implementation of AI solution I will not say that is not taken into account, but we should foster a more holistic approach in organizations, in enterprises, like with prototyping, with sandboxes. So in order to do that, we need to move to another community, the community of policymakers. And why we need to do that? Because like otherwise, relying just on the technical SCI things, we can induce situations where explanations are provided and maybe are not useful at the best, but the worst they can even use in order to game a system, to force you to receive an explanation that is not faithful, that is not accurate. Okay, so like what I advocate personally in my thesis is that we need to take into account different socio-technical layers, organizational layers, in order to really implement, in really to make the best out of explanations. And that's like basically where I departed my research, like the first main circle of AI governance. Let's have a look on how policymakers define, let's say, baselines for adopting and using explanation in enterprises, okay? And like I want you to keep in mind these three features that I will detail about shortly. So the first one is casuistry of like legislations. In other words, when we have a law and a law is enacted, you need to be able to interpret when is valid and when is not, given different constraints, okay? This is strictly connected to ambiguity. Like laws sometimes have this degree of semantic interpretation that is like possible in courts, you know, in order to really negotiate and trade off among different interests. And then we have proportionality. Proportionality is not related to courts, to litigation, is regarding the design of laws. So for example, this is a concept really strong in the European Union because like there is this approach stating that regulatory intervention should counterbalance among human rights and AI innovation. So like there are different things. We don't want to, you know, to remove the incentives to develop new AI techniques, but still we need to protect the end users. So one of my first works, indeed, it was conducted last December, and it was an analysis on how the European Union is enacting several regulations regarding artificial intelligence, data, and platform digital service, let's say, okay? Famously, let's say, in the explainable AI debate, we rely on the GDPR, on the General Data Protection Rules that it was enacted in 2018. And I wanted to basically understand better how these new bills, these new regulations that will soon come in force, like the GDPR is the only valid one, and the Digital Service Act and the Digital Markets Act are going to be enforced this year. But all the others are now being discussed by the European Commission and Parliament. And I wanted to see, okay, how we should treat explainability in that. And basically, like to advance macro distinction, I found that we have, let's say, two poles. Let's say maybe three, but it's better to say two, and I will explain to you why. On one side, we have explainability for oversight between an auditor and the AI provider or deployer. And then on the other side, we have explainability for user service. Then as a third pole, we have litigation. That is like when you bring explanations to a court, say, okay, this constitutes a burden of proof. Your AI system has been outputting this. And with this, like I can use this claim, this statement to motivate my reason in a legal court. So if you like start to see all these errors, like for example, many legislations, many bills are proposing to have explainability in order to enhance supervision scopes. And on the other side, we have explanations to have the deployers, the providers, to have access the auditors and check that the AI system is compliant. Then, in terms of provider and client, we have explainability like in the normal sense that we intend with explainable AI as a user recommendation, as a user surplus. And also we have interpretability on the other side. So when the clients want to interpret the process, the output. The thing is that in this legislation, like let's say the main side takeaway is that the component of oversight is preponderant, while the component of user service is pretty weak. Like if you start to analyze the GDPR, the huge debate saying that there is a right to an explanation. There is not. Like the right to an explanation is just a recital 71, but there are contexts where like the user should be informed about the logic involved about like an automated decision making if that automated decision making system is producing legal effects on the end users. It's really granular. It's not that easy and straightforward. So as a following work, what I've been doing in the, let's say, last February, it was trying to widen my analysis, not just to European Union, but also to the US and the UK. And I wanted to analyze basically how explanations are found, not just in legislations, but also in governmental communications, reports, and then regulations. And let me explain to you. Communications essentially are when like governments or supranational bodies are saying, okay, we have this AI policy strategy and we're going to do this and this and this in the following years, okay? Reports are more technical, let's say, as research papers are more technical things for the industry. And the meanwhile, regulations are the baseline where we should depart. What we found is that the European Union has a strong vocation for human rights, for proportionality. So like they have nice regulations that are preparing, yet like there is again, the interpretability needs of the users are met, but explainability not so strong. The US is even more libertarian. So like, since like we have the Silicon Valley, we have different approaches, we don't have regulations on AI. And what is most interesting is that if you follow the work from NIST, from the National Institute of Standards of Technology, is that NIST has been producing like great reports on explainability, like on the technical and socio-technical levels. But as an example, this was not reflected, so it's a really fragmented work, because this was not reflected in the AI risk management framework that it was released last January, this one, the AI RMF volume 1. Then finally, in the UK, we have another situation. Like the UK, let's say, has an approach to regulation that is very vertical. In the meantime, he said that Europe is more horizontal in terms of domain case of use of laws enactment, okay? The thing with the UK is that like they are fostering great AI strategies, but their approach is not to provide regulations on explainability per se, rather to conduct prototyping and sandboxes with industries. So like they are dynamically working the government with the industry. And this is something not found, in the UK or in the US. Similarly, with the situation of the standard, like the standards are essentially, most of the time they are not binding, but they can be binding. So they have like legal obligations to force AI providers to oblige to certain categories, certain thresholds, okay? The thing again here, that the situation overall, let's say for supranational like Europe and the others, and also international standard association, the situation is pretty fragmented. Just to give you a nice example, like you have the ISO IEC, that is pretty famous, like as a standardization body. You have different committees, different working groups working on explainable AI, and they have different deliverables, and they are not even connected. It's pretty weird, you know, like, and this is like something connected also like to the definitions of AI that like all these standardization bodies are giving. So like this is really not helping, I would say, in terms of operationalization of explanations in enterprises. If me as an AI company want to bring explainability, what can I do? Like the legal baseline is pretty weak yet today, not in the next future. So a recent work I've been presenting last summer at this conference in Oxford, it was regarding the, let's say, the operationalization issues, barriers that practitioners, data scientists are finding when they want to implement AI fairness tools given AI regulations. So for my section, like this was a multidisciplinary perspective on law, industry, social technology, moral philosophy, and others. For my section of industry, I found that oftentimes there are, let's say, no true incentives, no true structures in order to enable, let's say, human-centered values. fairness, or explainability. And maybe like regulations can help doing that, but yet at the current state of the European AI Act, we were analyzing European AI Acts. This is like pretty uncertain. So we don't know if bringing human values AI is gonna like translate in return of investments. What we did essentially, this is like super short, it was trying to basically highlight different moral values at stake with the European AI regulation. This is something that is not often considered, but just to give you, let's say, a breakout example. If me, as an industry, an AI industry, I realized one day that my AI service is faulty and is damaging human lives, let's say, is like damaging human rights somehow, I don't know, like with the allocation of funds, for example. What can I do? On a deontological level, like I need to value like human rights. I need to value the rule of law. So I will tell to the public opinions, like to the public, that this system is faulty and we need to find a way to recover from that. On the other side, if I adopt an utilitarian approach, I'm gonna try to cover likely these issues, this bug, and try to work my way out of that. Even if maybe like I'm gonna still keep damaging people's lives. You see here like basically different interventions, different trade-off that we need to calibrate. Because like if we tell that the system is faulty, me as an enterprise, I'm running huge reputational risk and loss of revenues. Well, if I protect, like, let's say my profits, I will keep like damaging like, you know, the civil society essentially. This is something that oftentimes is not clear on legislation, and this is something we discuss in this paper. So, takeaways from this section on explainability in regulations. There is no baseline on what an explanation is, are pretty much heterogeneous, and oftentimes are prone to risks, are unidirectional, are not really interactive, let's say. Are conceived differently across different communities, and having a baseline is hard, but is under the way, I would say, in terms of AI policy landscapes. And the thing is that we really need to ponder to have a more structural approach to explainability, because otherwise the technology is not going to be adopted and likely is going to convert in huge loss for enterprises. So these are a few of the recommendations I was advancing in my paper for facts, the one I written last February. Let's try to conceive, as I said, something more functional. Let's try to foster awareness over explainability, not just predicate to have explainability as a nice have. And then let's monitor and evaluate given new architectures. And this is, let's say, the main overall representation of this section. You can see on the left side, we have an explainer, a data scientist, and then an XAI tools that is already accessing some data with some quality, is having some design criteria that need to be justified on what kind of AI tools and XAI tools will be deployed. We have different risks regarding the output of the explanations, and then we have the communicative context that is highly dynamic in terms of linguistics, pragmatic values. And this is going to be reflected on how our recipients or how the end user, the client, is going to elaborate, accept, like understand, and perform given the explanation provided. So this work, it's like, let's say, this representation you saw before, is likely to, let's say, merge in a checklist that I'd like to develop for XAI governance. This is a novel concept I'm introducing. And what I'd like to foster is awareness over how to set desiderata for explainable AI in enterprises, how we allocate the roles and the function in terms of operationalizations, and how we prevent and we promote a virtual use of explanation given legal baselines. And then finally, how we introduce a new culture of explainability given enterprises in terms of XAI awareness. Then my case study for this thesis is regarding process mining. So is regarding, let's say, business intelligence. And this is another issue that is quite, let's say, engaging, because in process mining, oftentimes you get process representations that given different representations can exert a certain degree of cognitive load, a cognitive demand on the end users. So this is, for example, called a famous spaghetti model of a process representation. And essentially what we want to do with process mining is being able to optimize this process, is to detect the bottlenecks, and also like to provide, to explain, to give recommendation to the end users on the actions to take in order to improve these things. Like the thing is that process mining is pretty novel, like it's developing now from business process model, like from other business intelligence domains. So the adoption rate, at least in Spain, is pretty weak, let's say. Like oftentimes clients do approach process mining with just explorative intention. Okay, let's see what it can do. They are not really driven by, let's say, okay, let's optimize these key performance indicators or this task. It's not like that all the time. The thing is that in terms of interfaces, like we can see like different approaches, and we can rely on the studies done in human-computer interfaces, in process model comprehension with BPM, with the business process management. And these studies highlight how different representation, different interaction are basically converting in different, let's say, cognitive load for users. Okay, so in this case, we can even associate textual documentation from natural language generation, as for example, Iago is doing in his PhD, but this is still going to induce some sort of cognitive load on the end users. And if we look on how explainable AI has been presented so far in process mining, explainable AI essentially has been conducted foremost in predictive process monitoring, so in a just single task of prediction and forecast of processes. And what's most interesting is, since it's a pretty novel domain, there are not user evaluations. Like there are, let's say, quantitative user evaluation, not qualitative ones. So like we don't really know, outside of predictive process monitoring, how to engage the users with process outputs, with process insights. So this is, let's say, one representation I created now 1 year ago, and also like the other representation, the big picture you saw, it was inspired by this. But what I advocate in my thesis is essentially, okay, let's try to have indeed a more structural approach to explanation in process mining. Let's first detect all the different layers at stake here. So in other words, we have the interactional cognitive layer, we have the technical layer of explanation, maybe with explainable AI or not. Then we have the organizational layer and the pragmatic layer in terms of regulations and in terms of also like of data accessibility, of know-how, of like accessibility to information and other things in enterprises. And again, I will not detail this image, but you can see here that like in an enterprise, like for a process mining client or a process mining vendor, we have different access to different informations. And this creates situation of information asymmetry. One of the biggest issues nowadays in process mining is indeed like the barriers to accessing data silos and to integrate in vertical solution different systems. So one work we conduct pretty recently, and we are about to submit this actually, is that, okay, we can map on theory, you know, the accessibility, the stakeholders of these layers. But let's see what true practitioners are doing in terms of explainability strategies and inspection strategies, given the interpretability demands of clients. So we ran this online questionnaire and also semi-structured interviews online with practitioners saying, okay, how you inspect those, how you communicate insights to the end users. And through qualitative methods, like through qualitative analysis, grounded theory approach, we found, let's say, 4 main cornerstones here. First of all, explainability delivery strategies are nice to have, but as I said before, oftentimes clients do not know what to expect. So it's really hard to structure explanations. Second one, barriers. There are the huge barriers to data and system integration. This is something that, you know, is kind of jeopardizing the quality of explanations. Third one, every process mining project is highly contextual. One thing is if I'm running a process mining project with a doctor in a hospital, another one if I'm like using a small medium enterprise in the manufacturing industry. They have different intention, different expertise, and access to different kind of data. And then fourth cornerstone, strictly connected to the third one, maturity. So different clients are now approaching process mining solutions. One thing is if you do process mining, for example, in Europe, and another thing that if you do process mining in Australia or in Africa, like there are different markets with different needs. And we need to be aware that like in the likelihood of the future, like more clients will have more specific granular explainability needs. Then this is, let's say, this past experiment, it was more regarding the organizational layer and also the cognitive layer. What I'm conducting also on the cognitive layer, on the interactional layer, is also how users engage with explanations. And I am running now, sadly, since 1 year, this is a really long experiment. I'm running with some of my colleagues in my ITN and for XAI. We are running this basically comparative user study. It's not comparative, but basically is a task where given to process representation, so business process management and notation, and directly follow graphs, we ask an online couple, but they cannot see each other graphs. We ask them, okay, what's the root cause of this process? How we can optimize that? And we prime them. So like given different group of users, we can give, let's say, nice explanations, nice nudges, or bad explanations that are not useless or maybe are deceiving them. And we basically want to measure the degree of lexical alignments, and we want to measure the likelihood of the explanation to help or to impair the solution, you know? Then another thing I am starting now actually is, I think quite likely the only user evaluation, masquerade user evaluation for XAI in process mining. So my idea is to replicate another experiment I've been conducting with a professor, Professor Birna Weinbildenstein. Alejandro, correct me if the surname is not pronounced right, where basically we ask online different users on Prolific to evaluate how they comprehended and how they accepted, you see still the user evaluation dimension, different process representations. And yes, so this is overall all my contributions. So just to recap, as you can see here, like the green are the published things I've done so far. The yellow one are the one pending approval. In the meantime, the orange ones are the paper I am finalizing with the data analysis. And then the red one, the one I started just now, like the one regarding the explainable AI governance, and then afterwards the user evaluation. Another work I'd like to do, but I didn't not present to you today, is basically to have finally, let's say once the XAI governance is ready, to have finally an implementation in a real use case scenario with process mining, with a process mining company, maybe in Verbase, maybe others, in order to reprove the factuality, the validity of this governance framework and this checklist contained. So yes, this is it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Luca. So now it's time for interesting question, please. There is no questions. Everything is clear.
It's terrifying, I hope.
Please, one question.
We can go back
Well,
to.
I have questions. So related with companies that want to work with explainable AI, do you think how do you think these companies can be aware of the regulatory and legal requirements they have to comply with, and how can they verify the compliance?
Yeah, this is a tricky question because, like, for example, what happened, at least with the GDPR, it was like, even before it was enacted, there was a lot of buzz that like the GDPR was about to drain, let's say, data service, like data solutions based on that. And it was often allocated to the DPOs in the enterprises, so like the data protection offices. But in that case, like there was a really strong focus on data. Now we're talking about AI and explainable AI. This is pretty novel because most of the time, let's say that what we are witnessing now in AI ethics, in AI governance, is that oftentimes all these kind of, let's say, human values AI implementation, how we want to define implementation of AI ethics, is left to data science teams, to AI teams. And most of the time, like, let's say they lack the expertise, like they are not able to conduct, let's say, impact assessments. They don't know what is a risk management, what is like a data requirement. So what I would say is that what is pretty much needed and is witnessed by this, the definition is the second way of AI ethics. What is needed is being able to foster this awareness through prototyping, saying, okay, we have different teams in enterprises, we have different regulators, let's try to bring all them together and play around, with sandboxes, regulatory sandboxes, and in order to conduct assessments, in order to evaluate the risk, what kind of approaches we can have, all these things. So far, this is pretty left on hold, I would say, at the present. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And among all the regulatory aspects, what do you think is the most important?
Well, this is pretty philosophical question. So like one thing I witness is that, for example, in terms of regulatory intervention, the European Union has a really deontological approach. So in other words, it's like, okay, we want to protect human rights. We are, let's say, designing regulations in order to protect human rights. But we are not, let's say, forecasting the potential misuses, like the risk, given the, let's say, no virtuous use of AI systems. So it's not a really consequential approach. It's not based on the potential consequences. So like this is introducing a situation where like it's really, I would say, easy to bypass, to circumvent regulations. Like let's say on paper you have them, but you can find a way to even enact no virtuous use of that. I don't know if it's, so it's just to say, it's really hard to assess what could be the most important regulation, what could be the most important, let's say, ethics approach to that.
Yeah, this is quite a tricky question. Okay, Lorenzo, please.
First of all, thank you very much for your very nice presentation, Luca. I have a question, and it's like nowadays, where people is starting to be really aware on how potent artificial intelligence can be with the explosion of ChatGPT and similar technology. Were you able to measure any kind of drastic change in the mindset of the population now that these language models are fully available to almost everyone? Like from 2 years ago.
So, okay. This is actually a huge concern in the European Commission, European Parliament. So like if you follow the news, like there is a great website, it's Hero Active. So like if you follow the news last week, there was a technical meeting in the European Parliament where like they were facing how to basically introduce standalone high-risk AI systems in the regulation of the AI Act. And they were like kind of explicitly mentioning ChatGPT. The paper I'm also writing with on the XAI governance, I wanted to really have involved this PhD student and also the main ethicist at Hugging Face, Giada Pistilli, because like she's now working actively on the, let's say, on the risk, the epistemic risk of large language models. And what she's advocating, I mean, I don't want to take the words out of her mouth, is to understand that we are not talking to a sentient being, and we need to be aware on how the data is collected. We need to be aware that let's say the model is not disclosed to the public, so it has no scientific values. And all these things basically led to the fact that we can use ChatGPT for research purposes, but once we use it, we need to understand that we are delegating in terms of accountability or knowledge or episteme to something that is not an agent. So it's really hard to allocate accountability. It's really even hard to, let's say, downside situation of confirmation and automation bias. So I'm writing something, given a prompt, I'm doing prompt engineering just to hear something nice from the machines. And like all the things is that, okay, how much do we want to consider a large language model an epistemic authority? How much of epistemic arrogance we want to have them to give to them, you know? Is a really, I would say, uncharted territory, the one we are entering, because like, also like if you see now conferences or like journals or even other things, like for example, even on Amazon, like the science fictions written by ChatGPT, what we do is basically like providing stochastic parrots, like just using the concept of Emily Bender to everybody. And we are providing accessibility to fast information, but oftentimes it's just repeated. It's not really novel. It's not really censored. Like if you go ask Nick Cage about like writing a song with ChatGPT, it's gonna screw you up. Like, you know, I don't know if you heard about the news that happened 2-3 weeks ago, but yes.
Another question? Okay, so now what are the next steps in your PhD?
So like the really, let's say, missing important contribution that I would say I need to do before defending my thesis is to get this framework done and be able to implement and validate, I would say, in a use case, this framework. So what I want to do is indeed evaluate the, let's say, the best layout for explanations in process mining with the user evaluations, and also thanks to the insights I found in the questionnaire and the semi-structured interviews. And then I want to, yes, to see how I can tune it that further. So let's see how I can really implement in the real world all these theoretical frameworks.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. One more question, please. No questions?
I don't know why I'm on hold.
It's anyone in the...
We have been kicked out from the meeting.
Well, it's time, maybe it's time to close. Okay, thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Luca, for your speech. It was very interesting. So thank you.